So, Rocky, what makes the Frisco engine you got here so special? Well, for one, it's Russian. And before I get into that, the reason I'm showing this one to you guys today is because I bought this locomotive about 4 years ago, and when I first got it, I bought it used off of Amazon. It was a Christmas gift. A very, very nice locomotive. It actually came with the tender paint numbers painted over, and a set of decals for rebadging it as the for the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad. I don't like the MKT that much, so I'm probably not going to put these on. Previous owner's wishes are not shared by me. Anyways, so this locomotive, when I initially got it, it ran very nicely for about an hour or so, and then it decided it wanted to short out my transformer, and for the past 4 years, I've just kind of had it sitting stationary elsewhere. All of this dirt here isn't weathering powders. This is a mix of paint from the previous owner and genuine dust that's stuck to the engine from sitting so long. I've had this engine completely dismantled a couple times and have not been able to find anything wrong with it. And just out of curiosity today, I plugged it onto the track today, and what do you know? It decided to work, and it actually works pretty nicely. You know, it has pretty decent slow speed performance. It can haul a decently long train. This is about as many cars as it'll pull, but it looks nice, and it's, you know, it's... Oh, I gotta get into the history of this engine, because that's the real reason why I bought it. So, in order to fully tell the wholesome historic train story about this locomotive, I've got to change hats. In 1914, the First World War began, one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. With the formation of the Central Powers in Europe and the Allies, and if you've been through high school history, you know all the details that lead up to this. But what you probably don't know too much about if you go to an American high school is the Eastern Front. And in the steppes of Russia, where the Tsar's government was, you know, partaking in World War I and doing all the military stuff that you do in Russia, they needed locomotives to move equipment from all across Russia. This need would actually be even greater during the Second World War, but basically in Russia they needed larger and more powerful locomotives. At that point in time, they had locomotives from several European manufacturers, as well as some American ones, mostly built by Baldwin. And a lot of the engines that Russia built on their own actually tended to sort of have design traits shared from all the different makes that supplied to them. Essentially, the problem that they were having was most of their locomotives at the time were little 8-wheeled locomotives, and they had discovered great success with some of their 10-wheeled They had discovered great success with their E-class locomotives, which were 10 coupled locomotives, so they had 10 driving wheels. And as a result, they could run on lighter track while putting down more power. The problem was the E-series locomotives weren't in great production. They were only manufactured at one locomotive plant, as opposed to the several others that were making the smaller engines. So they contracted making these larger locomotives out to Baldwin, and they actually made the locomotives to Russian designs. This is an important thing that I find a lot of American rail historians tend to skip over, is that these locomotives weren't just standard Baldwin designs. They were very specifically designed by Russian engineers to be made in America. So just to get an idea of what I'm talking about, here's the two earlier Russian engines, the diagram for the U.S. production Russian locomotive. Notice the frames are assembled in the sort of Russian method in the space under the boiler and so on. And then we can look at the American-produced Russian export locomotives. You can sort of see where the lineage comes from with the U.S. components and so on. The overall width of the engine, too, because in Russia the railway gauge is a lot wider. And as well as that, the boiler has a lot of daylight underneath, which is kind of a typical Russian feature. A lot of American engines were built like this, but you know, this was a particular feature on Russian locomotives. So just about every Russian locomotive has this kind of thin sort of boiler and lots of wheels to spread out the weight evenly. So, 3 different locomotive builders were consulted with making these. One of them was in Canada, and 2 of them were in America. The American ones being Alco Locomotive Works, which is a short for American Locomotive Works, and the other being Baldwin of Pennsylvania. So, this engine, I believe, is one of the Baldwin examples. I'm not entirely sure. But essentially, they placed an order for 400 of these, and I think that was either the first or second batch. I can't remember off the top of my head. But basically, the Russian railways designed this locomotive specifically for manufacture in America. And if you look at some of the early diagrams, originally this was going to have plate frames, so the frames supporting the boiler and so on were going to be, single cast pieces of metal like they do in Europe. But in order to make sure that this could be manufactured in America in a timely manner, the engine was built with all kinds of the bar frame arrangement. So each of the wheels could, spring independently, because that's how they're assembled in America. As well as that, the cylinders and so on, which were originally done to metric measurements, had to be converted over to inches so that they could be built by Baldwin and so on without having to do any extra conversions. Anyways, so 400 of these locomotives are ordered for use in Russia during 1917 when America officially joined World War I. And in total, only 50 of them actually made it over to Russia. The actual number is kind of skewed, but it's somewhere around 50 engines. Another part of the order was actually canceled and as the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 occurred, and as a result, there were about 200 of these locomotives that were left in Baldwin's plant in America that were built to Russian specifications that on their own wouldn't work on American track without modification. So they kind of just had them for a while, and fortunately this came at a time, well, not really fortunately, it was World War I, but these locomotives were laying around at a time when America very desperately needed locomotives for moving things around. In fact, during World War I, the American railroads were taken over by the U.S. government in the form of the United States Railway Association. This was because, contrary to popular belief, shortly before World War I, the railroads really were not doing so hot. Effectively, what had happened was a lot of their equipment was really run down. The railroads had been spending a lot on infrastructure prior to that point, and automobiles got invented somewhere in that point, and things weren't going great, and a lot of the railroads were having trouble actually interchanging with each other because very few things had really been standardized, like signals and so on, and locomotive designs especially. Every railroad had their own particular type of locomotive that, yeah, it was kind of crazy, and so the U.S. government actually set in a set of standard locomotive designs. This is actually one of them. This is the standard switcher locomotive. These were built for a number of different railroads that all were to the same standard design. Kind of the same concept behind these, where the Russian railways were ordering these all to the same design so that they could be manufactured easier and interchange with each other, and interchangeable parts and so on. And so effectively, since the U.S. was cranking out a lot more locomotives because they really, really needed them at the time, these things being lying around in Baldwin's workshops were actually repurposed by the USRA, the United States Railway Association, and they were modified to run on American track, which is a slightly different width, and given all kinds of American features like, bells and all that stuff. And these were actually sold to a bunch of different American railroads. And they were sold very cheap because they just kind of needed to get rid of them, and they kind of just needed a locomotive, if that makes any sense. So for a time, by sheer accident, a Russian locomotive design, which was originally just kind of spare at the time, eventually became one of the United States Railway Association's standardized locomotives, kind of, sort of, ish. And so a bunch of railroads, which were, of course, not doing very well at the time and very desperate for more locomotives, even with the mass-producible ones coming into existence, several railroads were just really desperate for locomotives and were willing to get these things cheap and run them into the ground in 10 years. One such desperate railroad was the Frisco Railway, which stands for St. Louis and San Francisco Railway, which is famous for running through Texas and never actually going to San Francisco. They literally never finished it. Well, of course, we all know that the real San Francisco is the friends they made along the way. Yeah. So basically, Frisco Railway in Texas buys... They actually didn't initially buy these. What ended up happening, if I understand correctly, is these initially went to the Southern Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad. So the Pennsylvania Railroad tried them out at one point, and they did some trials, and they discovered that, wow, we actually really don't like these, and we don't want them back. Gotta give them to someone else. Which I find especially funny because they actually copy this design later, or made a similar looking engine later on, and I can't hesitate to think that maybe they built it because they liked this one secretly. But it's Russian technology in Pennsylvania. Well, it was built in Pennsylvania, but it's still Russian technology, so yeah. The Pennsylvania Railroad, they leased them for a while, and then by 1920, they wanted them off the property. So, that must have meant they were at least decent. Because you know my feelings towards the Pennsylvania Railroad.
East, east, west! There's a big cat!
But, yeah, so at one point the Southern Railroad tried them out as well, and they were just kind of like, yeah, we don't really, yeah. And another part of the story that I find really confusing is that some of the other railroads that use these were in the southeast and, in Pennsylvania and so on. And also the Santa Fe Railway had some of these. And what I find confusing is when the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Southern Railroad were selling these things off, you'd think that because I believe the Atlantic Coastline or Seaboard or one of the other southeastern railroads really liked these, you'd think that the Southern Railroad would have just given these over to their neighbor. But I guess the Southern and the Atlantic Coastline and the Seaboard, I guess they all hated each other enough that the Southern Railroad would rather send these off to Texas than give them to one of their neighbors. Which, again, must mean that they must have been pretty good. But yes, as a result, this locomotive was bought by the Frisco Railway. It's got the funky little Frisco Railroad badge on the front. It's got the numbers on the tender, like on Thomas the Tank Engine. I originally bought this engine with the intention of painting this up as the Russian version. But you know what? I actually really like the Frisco version. And I don't know, I just like the sort of Texas-isms that it has. So yeah, I'm just kind of doing switching with the engine right now, because the reason I bought this engine originally, other than the cool history behind it, and the fact that it's got so many little wheels, is the fact that it's it's a pretty moderately sized steam engine, so it can do switching and so on, which is kind of what I'm doing right now with it. So it's bigger than a switch engine, and it can go outside the yard and all that, and pull long trains if it wants to. But at the same time, it's not so big that it can't, come down into these industrial sidings and so on. And the little cow catcher on the front got caught. Yeah, so other than the cow catcher being a little bit wide, or the running boards at the front being a bit too wide, it can come down into these industrial sidings just fine. And, it can squeeze into these little spaces. And, yeah. It can do all the things that a much larger mainline engine, like one of them, couldn't really do. So there's the cattle cars dropped off. I also like the fact that it has crew figures inside. They're not very well painted, and I might actually, like, you know, put different ones in, but I don't know. To me, I think it's really important that a steam engine, in general, has crew figures, because usually with a diesel you can get away with it because the windows are... There's usually glare on the windows anyways, but... Yeah, this little hill part isn't very nice to it, but... You know, with the steam engine, you've got such an open cab on this that, you know, you can... If the crew weren't there, you probably would notice, because... You know, you can sort of see straight into it with this locomotive. One of my favorite features on this engine, though, and it's kind of an average one, it's not really a Russian thing, it's the doghouse on top of the tender. So, I'm not sure if you can see it too well, but there's this scrawny, tall little box that sits on top of the tender. And there's, you know, doors and windows on it. Basically, the head-end brakeman would go there. So most of you are probably familiar with the caboose being the spot where the brakeman and the freight train conductor live. There you go, just easing the power up. So essentially, the little doghouse on the back of the engine's tender on this locomotive is where the head-end brakeman goes. So as you can see, this one doesn't have a very big cab, and so it's nice to have that extra bit of room. Now, with air brakes being standardized on, yeah, it was just on a bad spot. There we go. So with air brakes being standardized on freight trains and, you know, American railroad trains in general, ever since the Appliance Act of 1893, yeah, that cow catcher, it keeps getting caught there. I might just cut off the little end bit there, because it's not like anyone would notice if it was gone, but yeah, you can hear the pilot beam scraping up against that switch. It's... But yeah, we got those. I don't know, I just find that kind of amusing. But yeah. So now we just got the caboose. Alright, now I can continue my point. So the house on the back of the locomotive, the doghouse, is where the head-end brakeman goes. So on most American trains after 1893, there was a standardization that all railroad cars got to have air brakes. And so it seems kind of silly, if you think about it, to have a brakeman's position on this locomotive after air brakes came out. But the reason they did that was so that they had a spot for a third man to go. Well, it was usually a man. I don't know. It was sexism was a big thing back in... Well, it still is, but, you know, railroad sexism specifically. Okay, so the little house on the back of the locomotive is where the brakeman goes. Now, the head-end brakeman, so, with air brakes being on all the cars, the brakeman's job isn't really to set brakes anymore. It's more about doing other things that are associated. So, for example, you've got a brakeman at this end of the train along with the conductor. So if something goes wrong at this end of the train, you have a conductor who is, you know, in charge of the whole train, who is understandably busy. And so having that extra person who can walk the length of the train up to the front end if there's something wrong, or climb across the tops of cars if necessary, or maybe if they're stopped at for an emergency or something, they can go on that mile-long hike up to the next signal box to warn them and so on. You kind of need a similar person at the front end of the train. So, for example, the engineer, you know, the engineer's busy because he's in charge of running the locomotive, and the fireman is also quite busy because they're in charge of monitoring this boiler and making steam that runs the whole train. So these two people have a lot that they're preoccupied with. And so having a third person is a lot safer because, you know, if you need... You almost always need somebody to ride on the ends of the locomotive and undo couplers and set handbrakes and, you know, signal to people and so on. And again, if something goes wrong, you need that extra guy to go on that mile-long hike up to the next signal box that way. And, you know, if you ask the rear-end brakeman to do that by, you know, walking the 100 cars of train and then walking that extra mile or so to get to the signal box, you know, that rear end brakeman's not going to be very happy with you. And also a terrifying thought that I didn't need to have until I was looking up what this actually does, because it's mystified me since I was a small boy. And understanding that it's more about having a third person at the front of the locomotive to do everything else that these two can't do, that makes sense. But a thing that I read about is apparently on a lot of American locomotives, later ones especially, I'm not sure if this one has one, I don't imagine it would, but basically the larger locomotives had these things called automatic stokers. And so with the automatic, this engine actually has an example of that, the little, that little thing there, that thing. That automatic coaling machine is underneath the tender, and it's putting coal into the firebox by sort of like pulling it down. It's almost kind of, it sort of vacuums up the coal from the bottom, kind of. It's just an easy way of explaining it for the sake of this context. But essentially what that means is instead of somebody slowly shoveling coal in, you've got coal that's kind of just slowly sinking into the middle of the tender where the coal screw is. And so as a result, if you technically had a third brakeman here, and for whatever reason they needed to climb on top of one of the cars to set a handbrake if something went wrong, you'd have them crawling across this pit of coal that is kind of being like slowly pulled out from underneath them. And I didn't want to think about that today, but now you have to as well, because this, it's just like, hey, I'm going to set the rear handbrakes, and then the poor guy's never seen again. So I was kind of confused earlier about why this is the only model train I have with the doghouse on the back, and you know what? Now I'm okay with it having that. Let's do something else with it now. These were great for running on branch lines, and also for doing switching and so on.
валяй дурака, Америка. Вот те валенки мерзнешь небось, что Сибирь, что Аляска, два берега. Баня, водка, гармонь и лосось, баня, водка, гармонь и лосось. Не валяй дурака, Америка, сам моря не скучаешь, поди, что Сибирь, что Аляска, два берега. Бабы, кони, раздоли в пути, бабы, кони, раздоли в пути. Темные улицы, девки умницы, любо-дорого с пляшем кадриль, что Сибирь, что Аляска, два берега. Свадьба, эх, запотевший пузырь, свадьба, эх, запотевший пузырь. потери. Всем рубахи пошьем вам, братва. Эх, корона Российской империи. Екатерина, ты была не права. Екатерина, ты была не права. Не валяй дурака, Америка. Невидимо кому говорят. Отдавай-ка землицу, Алясочку. Отдавай-ка родину.